Hello everyone, and welcome to Rome Retold. I am your host Tim, and together we'll be venturing on a journey to explore the history of ancient Rome.
Welcome back to part 2 of our coverage of Rome's early republican government. In this episode, we'll finish out this topic by going into a bit more detail on how the government and the legislative assemblies operated, and I'll be ending with a few comments on our overall understanding of Rome's government. To refresh things, we can remember that after the overthrow of the monarchy, Rome's newly created republican government selected its government officials such as the consuls, the praetors, or rex sacrorum. These all came from the wealthy aristocracy, and by all accounts, these positions were held exclusively by the patricians in the earliest days. The patricians claimed their exclusive right to hold these positions within the government originated from the fact that Romulus had chosen the top 100 men to be his senators back in the original founding of Rome, and that since the patricians were the descendants of these original 100 men, they believed that they possessed exclusive rights to rule in the government. But further still, they claimed that their strongest right to rule was owing to the fact that they maintained a closer relationship to the gods, and that they could therefore better determine the will of the gods. Of course, back in ancient times, there was no concept of a separation of church and state, and the two were really inextricably linked. These claims by the patricians originated from the fact that the patricians were priests under the monarchy, and they held on to this right for dear life as things transitioned into the republic, and they used it as a way to claim legitimacy in their right of rule. Now, the patricians continually asserted that they had these special religious powers, and that this trumped all else. This is almost like the medieval concept of the divine right of kings, except here the patricians were essentially claiming a divine right of the aristocracy. But even still, they couldn't simply ignore the average Roman citizen, and more specifically, the Roman soldiers. As I mentioned in our previous episode, the later Roman kings had begun enacting a practice of patronage and charity to the Roman people, and that they had also quite likely expanded the army and gave them extra privileges through the Second Legislative Assembly. Because of that, the aristocratic coup that overthrew the monarchy was in a bit of a precarious situation, as they were now the ones who were responsible for making this group of people happy, and that group being the average Roman citizen and the soldiers. So again, to appease the army and the Roman citizenry, the idea is that these new government positions in the Republic were voted on by the people in the Second Assembly, thereby giving them a semblance of power. Although only patricians were allowed to stand for these positions, everyone, at least in theory, were allowed to cast a vote. Now, the reality of this is otherwise, of course, and looking at how the assemblies worked, we can quickly see that the patricians largely gerrymandered proceedings, to use a modern term. They orchestrated the way that the assemblies operated, and they basically neutered any real vote from the people. Now, at least by the early Republic, the Second Assembly comprised every single Roman citizen. Now that meant that in theory, every Roman citizen should have been able to vote for a patrician magistrate when they ran for office. But this assembly was broken down into 193 voting blocks, whereby each citizen would cast their vote within the voting block that they were assigned to, and all of these votes would be counted up, and then each voting block would then cast one main overall vote. Now, this is kind of similar to the Electoral College in America today, and the idea of block voting actually comes from the Romans. Now, these voting blocks were divided up completely out of proportion, however, because although there were 193 total voting blocks, the majority of these were allocated to the wealthy patricians who were allotted a total of 80 voting blocks. Along with this, another 18 blocks were allocated to the equestrians, who were Rome's second rung in the social elite ladder. Now, there's also a group of siege engineers who were military specialists, and they received 2 voting blocks. Now, all of that means, if you add it up, that Rome's top social elite, who formed the overall minority in Roman society, as the social elite really do in every society, here, when counting up the voting blocks, you can see that they possessed 100 out of the 193 voting blocks. So even further, I think it's always important to mention that Rome's poorest citizens, called the proletarii, which is where we get our English word of proletarian, this group of people, who likely constituted the largest proportion of the overall Roman population, they were allotted only a single voting block. Now that is one single voting block out of the entire 193 voting blocks. To add further insult to injury, the voting blocks cast their vote in a specific order, with the wealthiest blocks going first. Once a majority was reached, which would have been 98, all voting ended and the proceedings finished. And what do you know? The wealthy elite just happened to possess exactly 98 out of the 193 votes, meaning that the wealthy aristocracy held the exact proportion of the majority required. But of course, none of this was coincidence, and it's exactly how the patricians intentionally set up the system once they established the Republican government. So, the vast majority of Roman citizens never even got the chance to cast their vote in the first place. So, although in theory every Roman citizen was able to attend and vote in the Second Legislative Assembly, the aristocrats had engineered things in such a way that never actually happened. Most often, the aristocrats planned their votes beforehand so that on the day of voting, everything simply proceeded in a way that had been previously planned out. However, despite that, I feel I have to mention that there are a few reported instances where the aristocrats did not reach an agreement, and this was typically caused by various internal division and arguments, and sometimes the vote would go on into the lower ranks. Now, this was seen a few times when the equestrians disagreed with the patricians over various things, and they cast their 18 votes for other candidates. And they would often buck the system in this way. But again, these occurrences were by far in the minority, and the fact that Roman historians took the time to record these instances of disagreement is partly evidence of how rare it actually was. Over the course of some nearly 500 years, we only know of it happening a handful of times. At the end of it all, the patrician magistrates who were elected still claimed that they were chosen by an election of the Roman people, and they still pointed to this idea as a way to legitimize the rule, much like the kings had done in the past. Now, to talk about the assembly a bit further, I'll also add that the Roman citizens were also not allowed to speak or introduce any sort of legislation or proposals in the Second Assembly. Really, most evidence tells us that it was impossible for the average Roman citizen to enact any sort of legislative change to the Roman government. In ancient Athens, in contrast, every citizen had the right to speak in a democratic assembly, but this was absolutely not the case in ancient Rome. Only the presiding magistrate of an assembly, which would usually be one of the already elected officials, such as the consul, could propose a bill before the assembly. So these were the only people that could speak and propose new things. Now further, these presiding magistrates were also the only one who could even call the assembly together to even meet on a legislative proposal or to take a vote. And additionally, when a magistrate did call together an assembly, they could not discuss the bill in any way, but could only direct the people to simply cast a yes-no vote on this bill. Now, in almost every recorded instance, the voters simply voted the way in which it was obvious the magistrate wanted them to. Now, because of the lack of any tangible effectiveness of the Second Assembly, historians have been able to draw evidence that indicates that only a few people might have actually shown up to cast a vote in the first place. And, of course, these individuals were simply the yes men of the magistrate sponsoring said bill. And they would have only showed up to achieve the minimum number of votes required by law for the bill to carry through. And of course, all of this would have been planned beforehand by the magistrate who is sponsoring whatever bill it was. Now, Roman legislation was called a rogatio in Latin, which means to ask, as the magistrates would put the question of should this bill pass to the assembly in anticipation of their yes-no response. Now, this illustrates how even the Latin language reflected some of the limitations being placed on proceedings, as again, they could only vote in this yes-no fashion, and it was really just a question they put out to them once they gathered, hey, are you going to vote for this bill? Yes, no. And that was really the only extent that the assembly provided for the legislative purposes. However, before a proposal or vote could be taken in the Second Assembly, there was another requirement that I haven't mentioned yet. Now, by Roman law, in order for an assembly to vote on any matter in the assembly, the bill in question did have to be discussed at a separate community meeting. Now, this meeting was called a contio, which means something like a gathering. A Roman law most often required that a contio had to take place at least 3 days before a vote was to occur, and that any bill or vote had to be discussed here by a gathering of the people. Only then could a magistrate call for the assembly to take the vote. So you might be saying, now, wait a minute, Tim. You've been withholding some information here. That sounds a bit democratic to me. Perhaps there was some equality with this process. I'm sorry to say, though, that I have to come in and crush that little snippet of hope that you might have. Because although the contio was an important part of Republican politics, it wasn't really the free-speaking forum of the people that you might think. Now, in general, we know very little about the contiones, as they were called in the plural form, for the period of the early and middle Republic. And almost everything we do know about them comes from Cicero in the late Republic, where Roman politics were really starting to get a bit crazy. On the whole, there are a few instances that we know of where the Roman people called a contio of their own accord to discuss a matter, but this was in the extreme minority. Most often, a contio was called by whatever Roman magistrate was sponsoring a bill, and they would then stand before the crowd and speak. Now, the people who gathered were not expected to participate in this discussion, but most often, the speaker simply tried to work the crowd up into a frenzy with fancy rhetoric and get them to support their bill. Now, this was again the picture of a contio in the late Republic, when many politicians began pandering to the crowd for popular support. I will of course get into this in more detail in some later episodes, but for now, it's safe to say that the contio was not really a democratic, free-speaking institution that it might seem like at first glance. Put most simply, it was only a formality whereby the Roman politicians would simply speak at the people, and it quite likely had little role in the political process until the late Republic. So, to provide a bit of a recap, let me just try and break down how a vote or bill might proceed in the early Roman Republic, just to try and make things a bit more clear overall. So, step 1. A patrician magistrate, say a presiding consul, has a piece of legislation that he wants to pass. So step 2. He sends out a public herald to announce a contio, gathering people to the Roman forum. Now, by all accounts, the contiones were conducted in this ad hoc manner, and they were not pre-arranged meetings. Now, this meant that only people in and around the city of Rome on that particular day might even be present to attend it in the first place. Step 3. A magistrate that would then speak about their bill, telling the people of its merits and why they should vote for it. Step 4. 3 days later, the assembly comes together to place their vote. Typically, the patricians and equestrians have already sorted out which way they want to vote, and they do so, winning the majority before any other social class even has the chance to vote. Alright, now with that maybe pessimistic view in mind, let me touch on one more thing. There is also a third legislative assembly called the Tribal Assembly that was introduced in the Roman Republic, and there was perhaps even a fourth. But I'm not going to talk on any of those in great detail right now. Now, Roman historians tell us that this third assembly was also created under Servius Tullius at the same time that he created the second assembly, but this is not generally accepted by modern historians today. Now, it's a long story, of course, so for now, I'm just going to let everybody know that a third assembly was created, but it was likely done about 100 years or so after the Republic was founded. Now, I'll say that these newest assemblies, the third and the fourth, were likely created in response to a lot of political grievances from the Roman people, as you may imagine, but these new assemblies were still often gerrymandered so that the patricians could maintain control. Now, it's also been hypothesized that the second assembly was also created at this later time, sometime in the 400s BC, but overall, I can say that a lot of the specific dating for these things does remain entirely speculative, and historians are still not really sure of all the details even today. But, I mean, look, I think I've covered a lot of information here already, and since it's highly likely that the third assembly came about later, I think it's best if I cover it later under the context of the struggle of the orders. Okay, so let's all pause for a moment, and we'll take a deep breath. Now, having talked about a lot of different things, let me try and recap everything as simply as I possibly can from both the first and this episode here. So, in the beginning, the Romans were ruled by kings. These kings were chosen by wealthy aristocrats through the Senate and the first legislative assembly. The kings, of course, began ignoring this process, and they began installing themselves into power, ignoring the aristocrats, and they undertook big building projects and charities to win support of the average Roman people instead of the aristocracy. The aristocrats were angry about this, but the kings continued to ignore them, and they even created a second assembly to further bypass the aristocrats, negating much of their power, and they began almost completely ignoring them. In this way, the kings gave more power to the people and to the army. After this, a catalyst occurs, which was the abuse of Lucretia, whereby the aristocrats ousted the kings and created a new form of government. Now, to appease the Roman citizens and the army, who still likely supported the kings, the aristocrats allowed the second assembly to continue to exist, still giving this group of people a bit of power in the new government. The aristocrats then created the Republican government. Power was split amongst the wealthy elite in the executive branch to maintain a balance of power and avoid another tyranny, while the Roman people were still allowed the right to participate and vote in the legislative assemblies. But despite that, the patricians largely negated the effectiveness of the average Roman's vote in the second assembly, and the wealthy patricians maintained a stranglehold on elections and voting. And that's basically it. Voting for new magistrates each year, such as the consuls, praetors, and others, was most simply done by a gathering of the assembly. Although it does seem that some individuals undertook campaigns beforehand, usually the aristocracy had again already sorted out who they were going to vote for the upcoming year. Now, I want to finish by saying that although the system was highly manipulated by the patrician aristocracy, it did in fact serve to maintain a balance of power among the wealthy elite, and it did prevent the rise of another tyrant from coming to power, which was what the aristocrats were most afraid of. Now, they had seen how ambitious men had been able to win the support of the Roman people and install themselves as an abusive king, and this was largely why the patricians had tried to limit the Roman people's access to the vote. Now, put most simply, the aristocrats believed the Roman people would simply vote for whoever was going to give them the most free stuff, and so they tried to negate this by orchestrating votes ahead of time. And by sorting out who would be voted into office beforehand and then simply casting their gerrymandered votes, the patricians could work out any disagreements or compromises beforehand, preventing wider conflict. Now, it might be important to compare this with the late Republic, when you start to get rogue patricians stepping away from this tradition and who begin appealing to the people to buck the system, cast their votes differently, or to ignore the customs altogether. I think the main thing to take away from the establishment of the Republican government is that it was not about equality or freedom for everyone, but it was really about maintaining an equitable balance of power among the aristocracy to ensure that no one man could seize power again. Now, these ideas and fears are also part of the reasoning for the American Electoral College today. It is yet another check and balance that is set into place where the electorates are, in theory, able to cast their vote for a different candidate if they believe the American people have been unduly influenced by a presidential candidate. Now, perhaps I'm giving the Roman aristocracy a bit too much credit here, but I would say that I can at least understand some of their reasoning for how they established the government the way that they did, based on how the kings had been pandering to the people to win their support. Alright, so I think that's the easiest and most simplest way I can possibly break down this chain of events from monarchy to the earliest days in the Republic, how the legislative process worked, and why the Republic was actually set up the way that it was. Now, there are, of course, exceptions here and there, and even halfway through this second episode, I have grossly simplified things to try and make the most sense. But that is the general picture. I want to finish out with a few more comments on what all of this really means to us, here and now, and to address our modern understanding of these things. Let's first turn to a big, possibly earth-shattering question that many people often ask about ancient Rome, and that I think we can now all try and answer. Was the Roman Republic a democracy? The answer to this may, of course, really depend on how we are defining democracy, because without a doubt, our modern notion of a democracy differed greatly from what the ancients thought it meant. And I think if we're using the definition of a modern democracy, most of you might agree that based on my description so far, the Roman Republic doesn't really fit that bill. But why do we often hear so much about it, and why is Republican Rome often placed alongside Athens as part of the founding democratic tradition? There was an important historian who lived in the 100s BC who wrote a major work on Roman history by the name of Polybius. Polybius is important for a lot of reasons, but one of them is his comments on government, and a lot of what he wrote we might call political science or political theory. Now, he wrote a somewhat famous, depending on what you might consider famous, exposition on what he believed was the natural cycle of governments, a process he called anakyclosis. Now, if you learn about historiography, which is essentially the history of history, you'll learn that the ancient Greeks and Romans viewed many things from life to government to the gods as all going around in a cyclical fashion. Essentially, there was this pervading belief that everything went round and round again. Now, this contrasts with the more linear concept of time and advancement that would develop later and largely continues today, but that's really a conversation for a different time. Polybius, though, wrote about the natural cycle of governments, which he believed passed from one form to the next before beginning anew. He then famously commented that the Roman Republican government effectively broke this cycle, as he believed it successfully instituted the three main forms of government, which he identified as monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, and he believed that the Romans had blended this all into one. Now, he saw that the Roman government introduced the consuls as a new form of monarchy, that the aristocracy was represented through the patrician senate, and that the Romans had achieved democracy through the legislative assemblies. Now, to Polybius, Rome had achieved the perfect blended government, and they did so through this careful separation of powers among these three different groups. Now, this should sound familiar to a lot of you here listening, especially anyone familiar with the American government, of course, as we often talk about the three branches of government and separation of powers. That being said, Polybius was actually a Greek who had been sent to Rome as part of a hostage arrangement following a peace deal after one of Rome's wars with Greece, which again we'll be covering later down the line. But trying to pass the time of his captivity, which was actually spent in the company of a wealthy Roman family, Polybius began writing his history of Rome. Now, I find that many people love to broadcast Polybius's remarks on how great the Roman Republican government was. But owing to the fact that he was a foreigner, perhaps we can see how Polybius didn't actually properly understand the Roman government, and that anyone even remotely familiar with Roman history should already see that his idea that Rome had managed to achieve the perfect government was very wrong. Now, although Polybius' assertions about the strength of Rome's government were commonly picked up by Enlightenment philosophers and even America's founding fathers, he missed several important things, likely owing to the fact that he wasn't actually a Roman, and he didn't properly understand how the Roman government really worked. I think we can say that the Roman government did not offer the balance of powers between a democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy like Polybius thought it did, most of which you can probably glean from what I've already covered in this episode. Now, really, it was just an aristocracy with the false pretenses of everything else. The aristocracy constituted the Senate. They chose candidates from among themselves to hold the high government positions like the consulship, and although the first legislative assembly was essentially by now a rump parliament, the aristocracy had manipulated the second assembly to the degree that it was nothing more than a gerrymandered good old boys club where they still controlled everything. I think by now I'll leave everyone to draw their own conclusions to the question of, was the Roman Republic a democracy? But despite the answer I think you may all be reaching, there are actually, believe it or not, some important takeaways here. Despite the many flaws of the Roman government, and these were flaws that would eventually see its undoing, many concepts from the Republican government still do form a lot of the baseline for modern democracies, albeit heavily modified. Now, it is true, for instance, that the American founding fathers based a lot of their ideas when creating the American government and the Constitution. They based a lot of these on the Roman Republic and the things that Polybius had specifically wrote. Thankfully, however, they were well aware of how the Republic ended up, and they made a lot of modifications to try and safeguard the same negative things from happening. Now, I'm not going to get into a lengthy discussion on modern forms of democracy, but I'll just say that a lot of the ideas regarding separation of powers and the different branches of government stem from the Roman Republic, although I think it's fair to say that modern implementations have been greatly improved. Okay, I'll finish out by saying that I hope I've set the stage for everyone to understand a bit of how the early Republican government was structured, and that there were still a lot of issues that needed to be worked out, and we'll be covering those as we move along in the chronological story of the podcast. Now, as we cover these issues, we'll see how the Romans handled them, and how many of the issues never really did get resolved, all of which culminates with, of course, Julius Caesar and the end of the Republic.
Thank you for listening. Feel free to check out our website at romeretold.com, where you can find out more about the podcast and find links to other platforms for listening. You can even support us through Patreon, where you can help support the time, money, and research that goes into providing this podcast. You can also find the link to our Discord server, where you can join our community, ask any questions, or offer suggestions for future podcast topics. Or you can just join in on any of our discussions about ancient Rome. Thank you, and we'll see you on the next one.